There's Yolanda. Hi. Fresh from NLC. You are completely muted.
Yeah, it says, yes, I danced for a whole hour because they
That's
had
right.
that entertainment and it was really, Nancy would have been dancing as soon as the first song was going on. It was really good.
I could have used some dancing today.
There you go.
What's that?
Yeah, really.
Councilmember J. Raj, just so you know, I saw your email. I will respond to you. I was not ignoring it. It's just been a day full of meetings where I haven't had a moment to respond.
Thank you, Mayor.
Mhm.
Give it another few seconds here before we get started. All right, good evening, everyone. This is our City Council study session for March 8th, 2021. And as always, we are doing this meeting continuously virtual at this time per Governor Inslee's Emergency Proclamation 20-05 and 20-28. And stay safe, healthy. The City of Auburn is prohibited from in-person meetings at this time. And the City of Auburn Resolution 5581 designates the City of Auburn meeting locations for regular, special, and study session meetings of the City Council and all committees, boards, and commissions of the city as virtual locations until Washington Governor Inslee authorizes local governments to conduct in-person meetings. So we will call the meeting to order, and Sean, will you please call roll?
Deputy Mayor DeCoursey.
Here.
Councilmember Baggett.
Here.
Councilmember Brown.
Here.
Councilmember J. Raj.
I'm here.
Councilmember Malenga.
Here.
Councilmember Stern.
Here.
Councilmember Trump Manuel.
Here.
All right, thank you. We will move into our agenda items for council discussion this evening. And first item on the agenda is our fourth quarter 2020 financial report with Director Thomas.
Good evening, Council. Hopefully this has been the report that you guys have all been waiting for to find out how we finally ended 2020. It was a roller coaster of a year, so hopefully this will be a very informative snapshot on how we ended that year. I'm going to share my screen. Maybe. There it is. All right. So with that, in your council packet, and I did double check numbers this week, the beginning of the full fourth quarter financial report actually begins on page 4 of your council packet. I'm not going to go nearly into as much detail as that full report has. I'm just going to go over the high level aspects of it and what I think are probably the most substantive impacts of 2020 tonight. So if you do need more information, that it is in that report, or I can try to answer your questions this evening when I am done. Oh, got ahead of myself. So as I had done in the prior third quarter update, I wanted to start with a recap of the adjustments that we had made in 2020, where we had started 2020's original budget, the reductions, reallocations that we made, just to help crosswalk when we're actually looking at the budget to actuals later after this slide, just to remind you that we did start with higher revenue budgets and higher expenditure budgets. So when we're comparing the budget to actuals, we started off somewhere different. We had reduced our original general fund revenue budget by $7.9 million. And you can see where that $7.9 million was reduced by individual revenue lines in that second column, with our most significant reductions being in sales tax, development service fees, culture and recreation fees, and the like. And those are all detailed on that page. We also, to offset these reductions in our estimated revenue losses, we reallocated revenue from other funds. So we pulled $2.7 million in revenue from other funds into the general fund, and we cut expenditures in the general fund by $3.7 million. So that was our plan during 2020 to account for what we had expected to be a $7.9 million revenue shortfall. So in this slide, you can see this is a summary of on the page 5 of your council packet is a much more detailed view of what I have here. It's summarized by different taxes and revenue sources. And this is how we ended the year. So I'm going to draw your attention mostly to that blue highlighted column, which is just comparing what our adjusted budget was after COVID to how we actually ended the year. So if you look at the total revenue column or row in that's highlighted in blue, you can see that we actually ended the year $4.5 million ahead in revenue from our adjusted budget estimates. And really the biggest contributor to this was our sales tax. Even though we did take some pretty significant hits in the first couple of months of the pandemic, we did recover, but we also had one industry that was much stronger than all of the others that helped carry us through. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. Our utility tax, we actually finished the year a little over $600,000 compared to budget. This was not necessarily from city utilities. Actually, our city utilities, we collected just a little over $9,000 ahead of our budget, and that was really related to reduced consumption, particularly during the first few months of the pandemic. So it's really all of the private utilities where we ended the year favorable compared to budget. There's a big number in that column right to the right for the utility tax, and that's the variance compared to 2019. You can see that we ended the year almost $1.8 million more than 2019. And that is really directly related to the budget amendment that we had done as a result of COVID to bring $1.8 million in utility tax. It's our 1% utility tax that usually goes to the arterial streets fund to fund arterial street projects. We pulled that 1% into the general fund, which is why it looks like 2020 outperformed 2019, and really it hadn't. In the other taxes column, again, we ended the year above our adjusted budget. We still were quite below 2019. The significant taxes in this category: gambling tax, admissions tax, and the criminal justice sales tax, which is the portion of the state sales tax that comes back to us for criminal justice activities. Building permits, same story. We ended the year slightly above our adjusted budget, but still below 2019. And I think that is something indicative that actually the strong performance in 2019 is indicative and really a result of why we did so well in some of our sales tax categories in 2020. Then intergovernmental revenue is the next category with the largest variance. We actually ended the year $950,000, almost $950,000 ahead of budget. And we exceeded 2019 by over $4 million. And this is really completely attributed to the CARES Act funding that we received. We received a little over $3.7 million in CARES Act money, which is why our 2020 number is so much larger than our 2019 figure. In the other category, we underperformed both our revenue budget as well as our 2019 actuals. In this category, it is rents, leases, interest earnings. Those are really the significant revenue sources in that category. all of which underperformed both our budget as well as 2019. And then transfers in, you can see that we had, it looks like an unfavorable variance of $2 million. And that's not, it's kind of misleading. We had budgeted $4 million to transfer into the general fund from our cumulative reserve fund. I know we've talked about this quite a bit. It was part of one of our balancing strategies for the 2019-2020 budget. We were going to rely on $4 million to balance the 2020 budget. Because we were outperforming some of our revenues as well as underspending our expenditures, we did not do the second transfer of the $4 million in 2020. So we break that $4 million transfer into a $2 million transfer in the first half and a $2 million transfer in the second half of the year. And we didn't do that second $2 million transfer. And we'll talk more about the impact the positive impact that has for our cumulative reserve fund a little bit later. For our expenditures, you can see we had a favorable variance compared to budget for all of our departments, as well as SCORE. SCORE is actually, that favorable variance is really more of a rounding factor and kind of what our estimate SCORE costs would be. Those didn't necessarily change from what we had originally known our contract would be at the beginning of the year. So there was nothing unexpected with that SCORE variance. And then our non-departmental savings and our non-departmental lines as well. So for a little bit of historical context, so we underspent $12.3 million in expenditures this year. But for historical context, we do normally save anywhere between $4 and $7 million in any given year. And I don't, save is probably not the right word. We underspend our budget between $4 and $7 million each year. And that's usually always attributed to salaries and benefits as a result of attrition and turnover just on a normal basis, and not being able, when we create our budget, we assume 100% of our FTEs are filled for 12 months of the year. And we always realize savings just with the attrition and not being fully staffed at all times. So really the difference, again, we have a much larger underspend than we generally have, but that is a result of all the departments working really hard to keep vacant positions open for as long as possible, keeping those positions frozen, knowing that things were uncertain with COVID, and just making sure that all of our staffing decisions that we were making were necessary at the time. And so we're not going to see that kind of underspend so far in 2021, because we're now full force filling those positions. I know HR can attest to the fact that they've been filling those positions, those vacant positions that we've been holding open in 2020. Their job began before January 1st even began. So that is an overview of each of the revenue and expenditure categories. There's a couple of main categories I'm going to go over in more detail to just kind of drill down into those numbers a little bit more. With sales tax, you can see the chart was a little topsy-turvy mid-year, but we really leveled out as we got into that fourth quarter, pretty consistent, pretty stable. We had adjusted our budget down over $3 million, and we'd started off with an original budget of $18.8 million for sales tax. We amended it to 15.6, and we actually ended the year at $18.9 million. And that actually is right in line with what our 2019 revenue and sales tax was. So we're pretty consistent with both the budget and 2019 performance. But in this next slide, I'll show you, I don't want to get overly excited about our sales tax performance, because if you look at it, $875,000 of our annual budget was, or of our annual sales tax receipts, was directly related to the construction sector. And the construction sector is really, we always rely on that and look at that money as kind of one-time sales tax revenue. It's not really a base that we can build on and budget for in the future, because once a project is complete, once a large project has been constructed and complete, we're not going to collect that sales tax again from that same contractor for that same project. Again, that is really a reflection of the permit activity that we had in 2019. We had some strong permitting activity in 2019, and that really carried forward with the projects that continued into 2020. And to Public Works and Community Development, they worked really hard to keep those projects moving and going and not creating any barriers, knowing how it was important to keep those projects on time in Auburn and getting them completed on time. But then really the secondary effect of that is the construction sales tax revenue that we were able to ultimately continue to collect throughout the year. Because if we hadn't received that construction sales tax revenue, you can see in all of those other categories, we saw some pretty big dips. Manufacturing, most of the subcategories under manufacturing were they're relatively stable. We did have one subcategory in manufacturing, one of our largest subcategories in manufacturing that underperformed in 2020, and that's why we saw some reduced revenue compared to 2019. Transportation and warehousing is kind of an interesting sector, which saw some really interesting growth this year, and that was almost entirely attributed to rideshare and not home delivery like Amazon, but like Uber Eats and other delivery services, courier services to have food and supplies delivered to you. So there was a really unique bump, although it wasn't overly large. It was an interesting, just kind of seeing how consumer habits have changed over the last year. The automotive industry really took a hard hit in that first and second quarter of the year. They have recovered every month since, but because of those losses in that first quarter, at the end of the first quarter, it took them a while to make up for the losses that they had lost in that first quarter. Retail continues to remain strong for certain subcategories. So food, home improvement establishments, as well as home delivery services are up in the retail category. Clothing suppliers and retailers haven't been doing as well. But I have a sub-bullet here on this slide for home deliveries for one of our particularly large companies that do home deliveries. We saw a 48.8% increase over 2019. So we collected $724,000 in sales tax from them versus $486,000 in 2019. So again, another very specific subsector that helped keep our sales tax revenue even with 2019 and even with our original budget. Our services sector is down. That is mostly eating and restaurant establishments, as well as arts and entertainment subcategories. So again, in general, our sales tax looks very strong. I am still keeping a very close eye on it as we go into 2021. With some of those large construction projects tapering off, we're going to expect to see some of our construction sales tax revenue taper off. And I don't think that our retail and our automotive and manufacturing sectors are necessarily going to recover as quickly as our construction sector might be tailing off. So hopefully we end the year even, but we really need to see continued growth and recovery in some of those other sectors to offset any decreases in construction sales tax revenue in 2021. So criminal justice sales tax, I put this one on. It's been pretty consistent throughout the year, but because it is a pretty significant source of our general fund revenue, I wanted to throw it up here so you can see just how it's performed over the year. Again, this is a portion of the state's sales tax that they collect, and we get a portion of it back for what they call criminal justice. They have a special calculation that they do based on crime rates, and that's supposed to help support the city for criminal justice efforts. We had originally budgeted $2.2 million. We amended it to $1.9 million, assuming that we were going to see a decrease in sales tax statewide, just like we were assuming we would see that in the city. And similar to our normal city sales tax, we actually ended the year above our original estimate, and we ended the year with $2.3 million in criminal justice sales tax. Then there's motor vehicle fuel tax. We started the year with a $1.2 million budget. We amended it to $1.4 million. So we actually adjusted it up. This was one of those revenue reallocations that we had done. We had pulled from the street fund, $423,000 from the street fund. We added it to the general fund. And then we also reduced it down by $160,000, assuming that there would be less commuting and less tax from motor vehicle tax. And we actually ended the year with $1.5 million. So it ended the year a little bit stronger than our amended budget as well. Building permits. We talked about this a little bit already. We originally budgeted $1.1 million, and that was really in line with what the activity that we had seen in 2019. We amended that budget to $720,000, and we ended the year with $836,000. So we did well compared to projections. We're still trailing 2019. There really hasn't been any change in the fourth quarter from the third quarter when we last looked at this data. Activity has been pretty even keel. We historically have bumps in May and December, which we did see kind of a delayed bump. Instead of May, we saw it in July of this year, and we haven't yet seen a bump in December. So maybe it's also delayed by a month or two. So maybe we'll see another bump in the first quarter of 2021. Development service fees. These are really attributed to three types of revenues, three specific revenue types. That is plan check fees, facility extension charges, and zoning and subdivision fees. We had an original budget of $830,000. We amended that budget to $650,000, and we ended the year with $956,000. So it really follows the same story as our building permits, outperformed our expectations, but still lagging 2019. And culture and recreation is a different looking chart from what we've seen previously. We'd started the year with $2.4 million. We amended it to 1.5, and we ended with 1.6 million. So this was one of those categories where we actually needed to make a lot of reductions in expenditures as well, because these are program specific revenues. And with those revenue reductions meant the elimination of programs, which also meant cutting costs because we were no longer putting those programs on. What kept the revenue coming in was the golf course opening in May. And you can see that the golf course really helped us exceed our expectations from where we thought we might end the year. Couple of anomalies. We did see a negative revenue in April, and that, I think we talked about this before, but that is really related to all of the refunds that we started issuing and processing in April to refund folks their money. They had prepaid for programs that were canceled due to COVID. And then in December, it's not necessarily significant, but it is a little bit of a bump. You can see the December actual is a little bit higher than the previous month, and that is actually pro shop sales at the golf course. So it looks like people did a lot of Christmas shopping at the golf course, which helped just a little bit. So those were the significant highlights for the general fund, but there were a couple of other really important things for the city that are worthy of highlighting tonight, and that is our real estate excise tax, otherwise known as REIT. That is our money that we receive. It's a tax on the sale of real estate, and it can only be used for very specific things. Generally, it is rehabilitation, construction, and acquisition of general governmental capital. That's a very broad paintbrush that I just used to describe REIT. It is actually very restricted, but we do use it for some of one-time capital projects that we need to do, whether it's facilities or parks, streets sometimes. But we ended the year pretty strongly. We collected $4.2 million in 2020 compared to $2.5 million in our budget and $4.9 million in 2019. Now, normally we do budget this pretty conservatively. So the $2.5 million was what we had originally budgeted. And you can see from the chart on the right that it it goes all over the place. It's pretty closely tied to the economy and the housing market, obviously. And just for conservative purposes, since it is one-time money and it is for capital projects, we don't like to over budget the REIT. And you can see in 2011 through 2014, we just didn't collect as much, and we like to be conservative. We have had a couple of strong years in REIT. The over collection this year was very helpful, considering we had to, that money that I talked about earlier, the utility tax and the motor vehicle fuel tax that we had taken out of the streets funds and into the general fund. We actually didn't want to stop any of the projects in those funds. So we backfilled those revenue sources with REIT. So we were relying on one-time sources of REIT money to fund those capital projects that Ingrid had in her street funds. So we ended the year with $9.9 million available in REIT. But we do have some of that money committed already in the 2021 and the 22 capital budgets. So I just wanted to throw that in there because to remind you that yes, we do have a very good balance of REIT, but we do rely on that REIT balance for capital projects each year. And so $7.9 million in 2021 and 3.7 in 2022. So the cumulative reserve fund, I promised you that we would talk about this a little bit more. We didn't do the full $4 million transfer this year. We only transferred $2 million into the general fund. Our target balance to have in the cumulative reserve fund at the end of the year is 5 to 10% of our general fund expenditures, which translates to $4.2 to $8.5 million. So that's our target. It never hurts to have more. We never want less, but our target is that $4.2 to $8.5 million range. At the end of 2020, we ended that fund with $8.5 million. So we're right on target, which is good. That will help with any one-time projects or unforeseen contingencies that could possibly come up. I don't want to tempt fate after the year that we've had, but being able to meet our target fund balance at the end of 2020 positions us better in case fate does want to try to teach us a lesson. Water, sewer, storm, and solid waste funds. I wanted to talk about these a little bit because COVID did have an impact on our water and sewer funds. So we did see a reduced consumption of 5.2% in water and 10.8% in sewer, which translated to $617,000 in less revenue collections in water and $259,000 less in sewer collections. So, we do rate studies every 3 years. We are working on one now, but so far because we do have a reserve fund policy for all of our utility funds, even though we underperformed as far as consumption went for 2020, we're well within still our fund balance policies and our reserves for those funds. And we are seeing a recovery with the consumption towards the end of the year. So as far as underperforming, those funds are still performing quite well. Our storm was not affected because that our storm rates and our revenue collections are not driven by consumption and therefore not affected by COVID. And same with our solid waste. We haven't seen a change. Our total revenue collected in that fund was $100,000 less than 2019, but for the most part, relatively unaffected and unimpacted by COVID. But just a reminder, there's going to be a lot more discussion and presentations to council in the upcoming months related to the utility rate study that we currently have underway for solid waste. As you all know, we entered into a new contract with Waste Management at the end of 2020, and they will be entering into that new contract. The new contract will take effect in the late third quarter, early fourth quarter of this year, and as a result, our rates will also be going up. So we are doing a utility rate study right now, and we'll be bringing our proposed rate increases to council in the next coming months. So that's just my forewarning, the information that you'll be seeing in the next couple of months. So last is how we ended the year with cash. We ended, as of 12/31/2020, we had $173.9 million in cash and investment balances. It's noteworthy, we actually ended the year $18.8 million more than the prior year, but in that balance is revenue bonds that we had issued for the water sewer storm funds back in June of 2020. I know it was a long time ago, but you might recall that we had issued a very large bond issue that refund some outstanding revenue bonds, as well as $15 million in new bonds as well. So almost $15 million of that additional cash is bond proceeds that haven't been spent yet for those utility capital projects. The pie chart on the right shows you how we are holding our cash and investment balances, how it's being allocated. Most of it, as you can see, is in the state LGIP, the local governmental investment pool. It is essentially like cash. It's like a very liquid money market or savings account, but the earnings are slightly better at 0.16%. And these are the current rates as of December 31st, 2020, the rates on these investments. We also have $20.5 million in our Key Bank money market. That's like our savings account. We actually bank with Key Bank, and the effective rate with them right now is 0.01%. And then next we have our Pacific Premier Savings. We have $10.5 million in there. That's a savings account that we have, and they were offering really good rates on those savings accounts. We're limited with how much money we can actually put in that account. So we have the $10.5 million in that account, earning 0.17%. And then last is our federal agency investments that we have, like at FHLB and Freddie Mac. We have $17.2 million invested there, and the current rate on those investments is 0.34%. And that is the end of our 2020 fourth quarter financial report. Any questions?
Thank you, Jamie. Council, questions for Jamie? Councilmember Stearns.
Thank you, Jamie. I was wondering, what is the tax rate on Uber drivers?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure what tax rate are you talking like a sales tax rate?
Yeah, sales tax, sorry.
They would pay, it would just be the whatever this, I'm guessing it would, I'm not sure if it's destination based. I don't know which sales tax rate they pay. It would be the same as any other business. But the question, why I'm kind of hesitating is that sales tax rate does change from city to city, and county to county. So I'm not sure how the state selects which sales tax an Uber car driver. If it's based on pickup, my guess is it would be based on destination. Is the sales tax rate applied?
Okay, I'm probably missing something then. I thought you said we collected sales tax from Uber, rideshare, Lyft, or whatever.
Yep. So we do.
Okay.
So if for like any other business that operates in Auburn, they add sales. So if you go in and you buy something taxable, they apply the 10% tax rate. The consumer pays 10%. That actually gets remitted directly to the state, because the city doesn't get the full 10% in sales tax. The city gets, 17 cents of that sales tax. So the state collects all the sales tax revenue collected, and then they remit us our small portion of it. And when they remit it to us, they do give us a report that kind of breaks down by category where that sales tax revenue came from.
Okay. So we get the normal sales tax rate.
Yeah, and my guess is as I'm talking through this, they must have a way to track where the destination is. That they have some way to determine which city and which tax rate to apply to an Uber driver, probably based on the destination of their passenger.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jamie, a couple of questions for me. You mentioned on the sales tax with the boost we got basically from construction sales tax, which is something that may not be sustained. I don't recall in our current biennial budget what your projections were for sales tax revenue, but with two items on there, if we do not have the sustainability of the construction sales tax, and of course with the loss of the streamlined sales tax, where does that put us for the next biennium?
And of course, I'm in the office right now, and I have my
I know.
my 2021 budget.
Yeah, I didn't bring
at my
mine
other
with me,
desk.
so, yeah.
I can tell you though that we budgeted 2021 to we started with 2019 as our base, and we
Okay.
did build a recessionary figures in for 2021. So it's going to be, our 2021 budget is either the same or a little bit less, actually, I think, than 2019.
Okay.
Assuming there would be a recession that we would climb out of. And we do have then an increase in 2022 over 2021.
Okay, very good. That helps. And then on the investments we have, how are those investments restricted? Is there any liquidity in those investments? How does that work?
What do you mean by restricted?
Is there any limitations on drawing down the funds in the investments, or I'm not quite sure how our investment pool works with the sums of money we have in the investments?
Okay, in our investment pool, there is no restrictions on that liquidity. We can take it all out and put it all in as we need it. So it's on demand, essentially.
Okay.
All those same thing really goes with the money market and the savings with Pacific Premier. Our federal agency investments, though, those are usually strips and bonds. So they usually have call dates or in call to maturity. So we wait for them to mature. Sometimes we roll them over. Sometimes we reinvest. Sometimes we just take the cash, depending on what the yield to maturity is on anything new. We might just take it and maybe find that the LGIP has a better rate at the time than our other federal investment opportunities. But really it's most everything is liquid with the exception of that $17.2 million that we have in yields in the agencies. All
right, thank you. Councilmember Stearns.
Thank you. I just follow up on that, on the investments. Do we have an investment policy?
Yes.
As a city?
Yes.
Okay. And what does it say in terms of like who we invest with? I guess, are we investing in portfolios that are, environmentally conscious or like, worker friendly, or I'm just, equitable investment policies?
Yeah, that's a good question as far as I'm writing notes right now. It's a good question as far as I know, thinking of our whole inclusion and equity framework that we've been working with. Our investment policy has got a lot of parameters around it, really to protect city money from being invested in anything what would be considered risky. So we really
racehorses.
Well, those aren't risky, right? No, no, we don't. That's why we really stick to those agencies. The government-backed securities is the primary, aside from savings accounts, the local government investment pool. Our other investments are really limited to federal-backed agencies. We have a little bit in our policy, we have a little bit of leeway to do things. It's really not best practice though. We like to maintain obviously we want to maintain our principal. We would like our money to work for us and earn a little bit of interest, but we're pretty risk averse when it comes to investing city money. I'll pull out our investment policy, but it does not speak to anything as far as environmentally conscious or equity and the equity inclusion piece. But that doesn't mean we can't find ways to build that in there.
Okay, any other questions for Jamie, Council? All right, not seeing any. Jamie, thank you once again for your report. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you too. Okay, next on our agenda is our King County population projections, and I'll turn it over to Director Tate. Jeff.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Deputy Mayor, Council, and Mayor. First of all, I would like to just orient Council to where we're at in the packet, and that's on page 42. You have an agenda bill, followed by a few pages later on page 47, a presentation. Rebecca Maskin is joining us tonight. She's a demographic planner who works out of the King County's Office of Performance Strategy and Budget. So in a second, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, and she's going to go through the slide deck with all of us this evening. Before doing that, I just wanted to add a couple of context sort of pieces for why Rebecca is here this evening and the efforts that King County and partner agencies are working through right now. So the background piece here is that is population projection and growth targets that really speak to both people and jobs. So people moving into our community and jobs being created within our community. And it's our comprehensive plan, our city comprehensive plan, that serves as the primary backbone, policy backbone for how a city plans for growth. So we have a comprehensive plan. When we talk about a comprehensive plan, there's a number of elements, or maybe the better word to use is chapters within that comprehensive plan. So there's land use like zoning, there's utilities and transportation, parks and recreation, housing, economic development, a number of elements to that comprehensive plan. And all of those documents are designed to serve how we plan for growth over a 20 or so year horizon. And zoning designations are one of those real key pieces for how we manage and plan for growth over time. When we plan for growth, we also have to plan for adequate streets, adequate utility service, adequate park services, all sorts of elements that all sort of wrap around what we're trying to accomplish and serve over a 20-year horizon or so. So how do we get at that number? That's what Rebecca's going to help talk us through. And one thing that's important to know is that the city of Auburn, as well as other cities in King County, have to update their comprehensive plan in the next few years. So our requirement under the Growth Management Act is that we update our next comprehensive plan or complete our next comprehensive plan update by June 30th of 2024. So we're in that early phase right now where King County is shepherding the rest of the county and the cities through that process. And I don't want to rain on any of Rebecca's parade as she moves through that. But it is a very comprehensive effort that starts with state projections, that move to regional projections, that move to countywide projections, and eventually into cities and how all of those numbers are divided up and what we all plan for. So this is not unique to Auburn, and Auburn doesn't come up with population projections on its own. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Rebecca. Give Rebecca a minute maybe to share her screen and get that PowerPoint presentation loaded and walk us through the process.
Thank you, Jeff. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me today. For the record, my name is Rebecca Maskin from King County. I work in our regional planning group within the Office of Performance, Budget, and Strategy. Can everyone see? I think I've done this successfully. So thanks for having me here today. I'm going to start our presentation with an overview, kind of contextualize the growth targets within the broader policy bounds of the countywide planning policies, which they are a part of. I'll explain a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about the update to those countywide planning policies, which includes the growth targets. And then I'll give you a deep dive into the inner workings of developing growth targets and give you a picture of where Auburn is and end up with a little bit about schedule. So the countywide planning policies are a kind of mid-cycle piece of implementing the State Growth Management Act. So you can see in this, what I call the waterfall diagram, we have it's a mostly top-down method where the Growth Management Act tells both comprehensive plans, so it tells jurisdictions the essential components of the comprehensive plan that Jeff just really laid out, but it also directs, at least in the central Puget Sound region, the Puget Sound Regional Council creates multi-county planning policies, which in turn guide the development of countywide planning policies, which represent our shared agreement in King County about how we update our comprehensive plans. So Auburn's in a bit of a unique position, not too many jurisdictions like this in our region, but you straddle the county line. So part of the city is in Pierce County and part is in King County. But thankfully we have a set of multi-county planning policies. So while we will independently create our countywide planning policies between Pierce and King County, we're all working from the same deck in terms of our regional strategy. And the countywide planning policies are implementing those multi-county planning policies equally. So the countywide planning policies are high-level policy direction to update local comprehensive plans containing kind of high-level information that I'll get into a little bit more in a minute. But the aim is to not usurp any kind of local control any jurisdiction has, but to at least set some regional or countywide agreements about those issues that cross jurisdictional boundaries. And the body that oversees and approves of countywide planning policies is the Growth Management Planning Council. So this is a body of elected officials. Auburn is represented by representatives from the Suburban Cities Association, cities of Seattle and Bellevue, and the King County Council members are also a member, along with ex officio members from the ports of Seattle, school districts, and special utilities as well. So this group oversees the development of the countywide planning policies, weighs in on planning topics that cross jurisdictional boundaries, and ultimately they recommend the updated countywide planning policies and growth targets to the King County Council. The council then adopts the policies, and after that, the policies go to each jurisdiction for ratification. And ratification occurs when 70% of when jurisdictions representing 70% of King County's population and 30% of the number of jurisdictions approve the countywide planning policies. So some of the other things that the countywide planning policies establish besides growth targets include our urban growth area boundary, how we amend the UGA. They set policy criteria for designated regional growth centers, which Auburn has one of, and just generally speak to topics of a countywide nature. So we are undertaking the update to the countywide planning policies now for a number of reasons. They were last adopted in 2012, and that's really when our last set of targets were adopted as well. And since then, there have been a number of major initiatives and plans adopted, including Vision 2050, which was adopted in October of 2020. Our region has approved Sound Transit 3. There's been a handful of amendments to the Growth Management Act, mostly related to the Buildable Lands program that we need to update our countywide planning policies for. And also of note is the work of the Growth Management Planning Council's Affordable Housing Committee. So there's a regional housing affordability task force that has an action plan. And so we're updating our countywide planning policies, especially related to housing, to address that action plan. To make sure that we were containing the scope for updating the CPPs, we created these guiding principles. And essentially, they set the 2012 policies as a baseline. So we're not revamping the entire project. We are starting from 2012's countywide planning policies. We're centering social inequity and health, and this is a key component of the update to Vision 2050 as well. And then we're integrating some of those policy changes from those key sources that I listed off before, just wanting to contain the scope for this. We want to make sure that the direction that the CPPs provide is clear and actionable for jurisdictions updating their comprehensive plan. And finally, we want to implement Vision 2050's regional growth strategy by creating a set of growth targets that jurisdictions can use to update their comprehensive plans. So the chapters within the countywide planning policies mirror the elements of the comprehensive plan, essentially. So the next couple slides, I'm not going to read them to you. I know they're in your packet. So they just kind of step through some of the key themes that are a part of each chapter. And I'll just let you know where we are in the process of updating the countywide planning policies. The Growth Management Planning Council has a draft set of amended policies right now, and we'll be weighing at their March meeting whether they'd like to release that draft set of policies, including some draft growth targets, as a public review draft and kick off a comment period for approximately 30 days or 45 days. So I'm going to step into the growth targets now. I'll give you a high level overview about what growth targets are, and then we'll kind of step through the process of creating them. So growth targets are in the CPPs. So they are a policy statement about the number of housing units and jobs that each city is going to be planning for their 2024 comprehensive plan. The targets will cover approximately 2019 through 2044. So giving you that 20-year planning horizon from when the plans are adopted. We create growth targets collaboratively amongst all the cities and King County together. King County facilitates this process, but we need each jurisdiction's local expertise and participation to create a set of growth targets that we can all live with and we want to plan for in our comprehensive plans. Real technical detail that we only create the targets for the urban area. So the rural unincorporated area does not receive targets. And again, they are a part of the countywide planning policies. So the creation of the targets starts as a pretty top-down process. As a part of a coordination with the other counties and in the region, we really use Vision 2050 and the growth strategy in it as a starting place for creating a countywide projection and then projections at the regional geography level. Regional geographies are groups of cities that share similar characteristics. Auburn is a core city. Core cities have regional growth centers and high capacity transit. So you are in good company with cities like Kent, Renton, Redmond, I'm trying to remember the other ones, Kirkland, those sort of cities. There's about 11 in King County. So once we have those regional geography allocations, then we can start the process of actually creating jurisdictional growth targets. And now I'm going to step through each one of those steps. So the real start is having a regional forecast. The starting place for that are the Office of Financial Management population projections. So the state OFM creates projections out to 2050. We take those projections and we also look to a regional forecast that the Puget Sound Regional Council creates so we can get a sense about the expected employment forecast. We are using that PSRC forecast for our starting place. On the population side, it is congruent with the OFM population projections, so there's no concern there. We're pretty much right in the middle of the OFM projections, so pretty average for the next 20-25 years. So once we have that regional number decided, and as I'll also note, because Auburn straddles King and Pierce counties, that our counties have kind of collaborated and agreed to use that population forecast as a starting place. So you should be looking at a similar time horizon and a starting place for the overall forecast for the region. The next step is to take that regional forecast and apportion it down to the county level. To do this, we use the regional growth strategy within Vision 2050. And you can see that expressed in the chart at the bottom of the screen. About 50% of the population growth and about 59-60% of the job growth within our region is expected or anticipated to go to King County. And so that is the share that we apply to the regional forecast to create countywide control numbers for population and jobs. When we have those countywide population controls, we perform a similar step from the regional growth strategy to translate those countywide numbers to regional geographies. And then this step is pretty similar. It's just a fun twist at the end. So we apply the shares of growth to regional geographies to that countywide number. And then we have regional geography level population and jobs. The fun twist I mentioned is that we translate the population into housing units at this step because we create our targets in terms of housing units and jobs. So we use some assumptions that are attuned to each regional geography to do that. And at this end of this stage, we have regional geography level control totals of housing units and jobs for 2019 to 2044. So this is what that number looks like for the core cities geography and for King County as a whole. So overall, we're anticipating about 300,000 new housing units from about 2019 to 2044 and almost 500,000 new jobs. That breaks out to the core cities and the numbers you see here. It's about 113,000 new housing units and about 223,000 new jobs, just based on the percentages in that last slide. That's the last slide. I changed the order of 2 slides in this spreadsheet if you're looking at your packet at all, but just know that the other spreadsheet table of numbers is coming next. I just wanted to explain where we got it from. So with those regional geography allocations, the next step is that we are about ready to engage with the jurisdictions to determine what our growth targets will be. To do that, we seed the conversation with a variety of different scenarios that depict what different growth targets could look like if we proportionally divvied up that regional geography total to individual cities. So I like to think about that like each regional geography is a cake, and we are figuring out how to apportion the slices to individual cities. And the kind of template or knife we use to do that, we use a bunch of different scenarios related to different data sources that have to do with growth. So we look at the existing distribution of housing units and jobs. We look at the remaining capacity in each jurisdiction. And we collect that data for each city, sum it up, and then create a proportion that each city has amongst the regional geography, apply those shares to that regional geography control total. So we created a variety of different scenarios for each city within the regional geography. And I know this table is a little confusing, so I will walk through it. So at the top, all of the numbers on this screen represent different target scenarios. So 2019 to 2044 growth for each of the core cities based on a proportional share that that city has of whatever the data factor is listed in the heading here. So the leftmost column here represents a set of growth targets for the core cities that are created depending on the current distribution of housing units in each city. This category, the second column, represents what a housing target would be for each city based on their existing growth targets that we already go through 2035. The third column is representing what targets would be if that regional geography total was allocated based on recent growth. The fourth column is about capacity, dividing that regional control total to each city based on its proportional share of housing capacity. And the last, very confusingly, is if we allocated housing growth based on each city's proportional share of employment. And the reason we did that was some folks are very interested in the balance of jobs and housing, and so wanted to see if we split the allocated housing growth based on the number of jobs that we have, how does that shake out? So that same kind of logic applies on the right side of the screen, but for employment targets. So each one of these columns on the right table represents a scheme of housing targets, employment targets created by the data factor that you see in the column header. So I won't go through them precisely as I did. I want to make sure we have time to get through everything here. But just know that these were preliminary targets that we created to seed the conversation. The actual growth target that's right for Auburn may not be represented in these numbers. It doesn't have to necessarily fall between, for example, 9,200 and almost 13,000. But we work together collaboratively amongst the jurisdictions in the regional geography to arrive at what the right growth targets are. And so that's the phase of the process that we're really at now. We've had about 4 meetings of the cities in the core city group. And we are at a place where we're preparing to create a set of draft growth targets. I think we're very, very close on housing. We have a little bit more work to do on jobs. But basically, this is a negotiation or deliberation amongst these cities to determine collectively what the right growth targets are for the next planning period. So our goal is to complete this work, at least have a draft set of targets by the end of March, so end of this month, that we can recommend to the Growth Management Planning Council to release as a public review draft with the rest of the countywide planning policies. So some of our schedule longer term. So after we release that public review draft in March, we anticipate about a month and a half of public review and comment period. In May, we will come back to the GMPC and tell them about the comments we received, make any amendments that we need to, and we're pushing for GMPC approval of the countywide planning policies and the growth targets by the end of June 2021. From there, the process moves to the county council. That we are anticipating it's about a 3-month adoption period. So the county council will deliberate, likely adopt the countywide planning policies, and then it goes back to the cities for ratification. So we anticipate this will be in approximately the 4th quarter of 2021, where you will get a chance to review and ratify the countywide planning policies. Our goal, and this timeline is really driven, that the updated countywide planning policies are due to the Puget Sound Regional Council by December 31st, 2021. So that's my presentation today, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions or flip back to slides as necessary.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to add one more piece for council's benefit, and that is that at the same time that we're going through this process, the city, along with the 5 other South King County cities of Renton, Federal Way, Burien, Kent, and I'm leaving one out, but there's 6 of us that are going through the Housing Action Plan. And you had a presentation a few weeks ago from Eco Northwest to talk about housing in Auburn and housing more generally in South King County. And it's interesting to watch these processes move forward concurrently, and that process with the presentation that Tyler provided a few weeks ago is really coming in very close to the numbers that county is presenting through this countywide planning policy update. And that what we're seeing is we have a need to provide housing in the future to accommodate our growth, but we also have a need to look at housing and any deficit that we might have that's contributing to affordability crisis that is going on in our region. So those numbers together are blending nicely, I would say. They're not polar opposite or anything like that. So it's going to be additional work and information that council will have in the coming few weeks as that housing action plan, those conclusions are presented to City Council.
Great, Jeff, thank you for that. You actually answered my question. That was the question I was going to ask. So, Councilmember Malinga, did you still have a question?
Yeah, I think Jeff kind of answered my question as
Okay.
well. I guess just for my understanding, on the slide where you show the two growth projections for housing and for jobs, and they were comparing, and you had a line for Auburn. I didn't understand the big variance on there when it said the housing units for 2020, one said like 20,000 and one said like 10,000. Why was there such a big difference? That's what I'm just trying to understand.
Sure. So they really vary based on the share that Auburn occupies out of the whole regional geography. So if Auburn has 10% of the housing units for 2020, then it's going to get 10% of the growth target in that scheme. But if the city has 20% of the overall capacity within those core cities, then it will receive 20% of that allocation. So there's some variance built in there to kind of create a range and give people a lot to chew on to try to figure out what the right growth target is.
Thank you.
Councilmember Stearns.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could like flesh out for me just what are the impacts if we don't meet our housing targets. I mean, or say Kent doesn't meet theirs and we do, but what happens?
So about 5 years after we adopt our comprehensive plans, maybe a little bit less, we do a mid-cycle check on how we're doing meeting our planning goals. The biggest step in that is calculating the amount of capacity in the city of Auburn and comparing that to the remaining target, but it also includes measuring how cities are doing in achieving those growth targets. If as a result of that process, and this is the buildable lands process, if as a result of that buildable lands check, we see that Auburn is meeting its growth target or how we define meeting the growth target or exceeding that, we note that in the report and move on. If we find that the city is falling short of its housing or job growth target, it's possible that the city would need to kind of create a performance improvement plan, I'll call it, but it's called, they're called reasonable measures that you would need to adopt in your next comprehensive plan. So really the reasonable measures are things that I like to think about as good planning. Like for jobs, it would be like an economic development plan, or more on the housing side, it could be considering potential rezones or taking a look at your development regulations and make sure that folks can really build to those maximums that you're planning for. So there's some kind of policy related sticks in terms of if not meeting growth targets, but there's nothing necessarily tied to funding or any kind of other punitive measures.
Right. I was wondering more, what's the fallout? You know, what are the bad results? Say we just go, we're not going to do it, you know, stick or no stick. But what happens if a city doesn't do that? What is, I mean, is it bad or is it just like too bad?
I guess it kind of depends on when it happens. So if the if we adopt targets now, we set them for what we think is reasonable, and by the time the city gets to doing its comprehensive plan and the land use assumptions, the housing and jobs that the city is using for its travel demand modeling and its housing need assumptions, if those are not substantially consistent with the growth targets, then that could lead to a finding by the Puget Sound Regional Council that your plan could be not certified or conditionally certified, and you might be ineligible for transportation funding, as well as it's kind of like a regional contract that each jurisdiction has with its peer cities. So the growth is going to go somewhere. We want to make sure we're planning for it the best that we can. We don't always know how much is going to happen, but we want to at least try to be good neighbors and plan together.
Yeah, and I'd like to just emphasize a point that Rebecca made in there, which is when we go through a comprehensive plan update, not only are we working with the county to establish these sort of operating parameters that we're building our plan and our policies around, but we also have to present that comprehensive plan to the Puget Sound Regional Council for kind of their sanctioning. They'll take action and say, yes, this plan fits into the regional initiatives that we all work on. So important to know that, because if we went, Councilmember Stearns, if we went and decided, hey, thanks, but no thanks, we're not going to do this, there's a pretty heavy funding penalty, I would say, for not doing that, because then we're not going to have an approved plan under PSRC, and we're not going to receive the funding packages or the eligibility for funding down the road.
Rebecca and Jeff as well. Is there any room for any variables that could take place, especially in the number of housing units? I serve on the Growth Management Policy Board and on the Affordable Housing Committee, and sometimes our numbers aren't quite matching and related to the number of housing units needed over that period of time. And most recently, we heard that there's been a Microsoft study that shows the number of housing units have now topped more than like 325,000 over the period of time we're talking about. So how fluid can that be, and what are the adjustable factors that are made or can be made in that? And then also related to population growth, with the pandemic, we have seen a shift to people working from home, and that may be continuing on as we move forward, even as we come out of the pandemic, which many companies may decide to be more beneficial to them and their employees on that. Does that have any factor in the numbers that are being presented?
I would say not yet. So we will be receiving a new population projection from the OFM, kind of inconveniently timed in 2022, inconveniently for our comp planning. So we have built into our schedule so far that once those projections are released, we will take a look, make sure we are still planning for growth in line with those projections, and do that quick check there. So that's one potential possibility for a check-in on those growth numbers. Some of the other options are really uncertain right now. I think we're all still waiting for some quality information about how long the disruptive trends we're seeing from COVID are really going to last. And I think it's going to take a few years for us to really figure that out. The good news is that we set growth targets and do comprehensive plannings on a regular update. And so in 7-8 years right now, we will revisit our growth targets and make any adjustments also kind of in that iterative process.
Great, thank you very much. Councilmember Trout-Manuel.
Rebecca, could you explain what the job capacity is?
Sure. So I mentioned earlier our buildable lands process, where we calculate the amount of capacity for each city's growth target. And so we do that for housing, which is pretty straightforward, but we also do it for jobs to make sure that we have enough space for our jobs target. And so how we do that is kind of a land and zoning based method. So we look to identify the kind of available land supply of vacant and redevelopable properties. We work with city staff to define what developable and vacant mean in each jurisdiction. We find that land, and then we look to development that has happened recently to kind of understand the density that development has happened at. And then essentially we multiply that land supply by the density to get an amount of built space that could potentially be developed in each jurisdiction. And then we convert that to jobs based on some assumptions that are kind of gathered from known data sources, recent developments, kind of making sure that they're up to date for our current century or decade, to convert that built space into jobs. So that's where that jobs capacity number comes from.
Okay. I guess you answered my question. Thank you.
That's quite a formula.
I left out some details.
Yes. Any other questions for Rebecca, council? All right, not seeing any. Rebecca, thank you very much for your presentation. We look forward to some future information. And Jeff, thank you once again.
Thank you. Have a good night.
All right, now we will move on to our municipal service discussion items. And for this portion of the meeting, I will turn it over to Councilmember J. Raj.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Council, good evening. This evening, we have Commander Steve Stalker, who will present an analysis on the 2020 inspectional service reports. And Steve Stalker, Commander Stalker, are you there?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're up.
Great. That's my biggest worry is the electronics would fail at the last second. Thank you very much. Council members, Mayor, good evening. Thank you for inviting me to present this report. I'm going to try and share my screen here now. Should be up now. Okay, so yeah, this is the 2020 Inspectional Services CIA and use of force analysis. And if you don't know, CIA
Steve,
is.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
The screen is your one with notes.
Okay. Let me switch that then.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So if you don't know, CIA stands for commendations, inquiries, and allegations. So the first half of the presentation here will focus on the CIA reports, and then we'll move into use of force statistics and analysis. On my first slide here, it's just this here covers everything for the CIA report and the use of force report. So as you can see here, we had 73,998 CAD incidents. So we relate that to as having 73,000 contacts that our officers had in 2020. That was down 14% from last year. We had just over 15,000 case reports, which was also down a little bit. Just over 3,600 arrests, which was down 21%. And we only had 1,652 booked into score. And I use the word only because we were down 42% in bookings into score in 2020. So this slide represents our commendations for the year of 2020. And I'll try and kind of define each commendation a little bit also as we go through this. So in total, we had 167 commendations. Now, a general commendation that we have, which is the most prevalent that we get, is just when we receive a positive recognition from the public or from another member of the department regarding one of our employees, and that gets noted as a commendation. We also have a letter of commendation, which is if a department personnel employee performs a commendable act, which is just perceived to be worthy, that we believe is kind of above and beyond their normal work, then they can receive a letter of commendation in their file. The highest medal on here that you see, Medal of Valor. The Medal of Valor is when an employee does an act of extreme courage that's beyond the normal demands for their service. And it's when they're at substantial risk to their physical activity and that substantial risk actually existed and the individual is unquestionably conscious of the threat. In 2020, we did not have a Medal of Valor. It's pretty rare that an officer receives the Medal of Valor. I will say, though, for next year, you will see a number up there because one of our officers already received the Medal of Valor this year from a SWAT incident that involved a hostage situation with a child. And but that is not reflected on this report. We also have a Medal of Distinction, which would just be right below the Medal of Valor. So if someone has great courage also in the performance of their duty, and the risk to the individual's physical safety existed, and there was reason to believe that that risk was present, but it doesn't quite meet the Medal of Valor, then they will receive a Medal of Distinction. As you can see, we had 3 Medal of Distinctions in 2020. And the example of that, a couple officers on another SWAT situation that occurred in 2020 that also involved a hostage situation. The subject actually fired rounds at 2 of our officers out the back window. And just based on the actions of the officers after that occurrence and during that entire call, they received a Medal of Distinction. We also have a life-saving medal, and as you can see, we had 10 life-saving medals issued in 2020. This is an act that is performed personally by the officer, but it also has to be affirmed by a competent medical authority that the officer actually saved a human life or prolonged the life beyond the day of extraordinary circumstances is how we define that. So usually it's, as you know, we have Narcan in the cars for the officers. So when an officer goes out, if they do use the application of Narcan, and I'll use this as an example because this happens fairly frequently, just the use of the Narcan will not get an officer a life-saving medal because it's really hard to tell if that's what actually saved the person's life. However, if the officer uses Narcan and they do a great job under pressure, it may be directing other people to do things, and they perform actual physical CPR and maybe hook up the AED, and then we get a medical professional that says that they more than likely saved that person's life, that will give them a life-saving medal. And we had 10 of those in 2020. The merit medal, we didn't have any merit medals in 2020, but again, we had 2 merit medals already given out in 2021. That is when an individual distinguishes themselves by excellence in the event in a tactical situation. And so to give you an example of that, what in 2021, an example of that was on another SWAT call out, officers involved in a situation based on their actions in that situation, they're going to receive a merit medal in 2021. But that'll be on next year's report. Excuse me. Okay, so under the CIA report, we also, these are the statistics for an internal investigation. So an internal investigation basically involves the complaint of a possible violation of department policies, city policies, or maybe even civil service rules. These allegations can include complaints of bias-based policing, excessive force, insubordination, civil rights violations, false arrest, or just allegations of serious misconduct. And it could also be that it's not maybe a real serious allegation, but it could be that it's maybe the 3rd or 4th time on a particular employee, and that might rise to the level of an internal investigation. So they're pretty serious allegations to get to this level. And in 2020, we had 9 internal investigations, and 6 of those investigations had the outcome of misconduct. I have a percentage there of 0.01%, which is, if you put it into relation of the 73,000 contacts that our officers have throughout the year, we just had the 9 allegations that we felt rose to a level of an internal investigation. And I think it's important to keep in mind too, that sometimes these allegations are derived from within the department. Could be a commander or a sergeant or someone that notices something or sees something and starts the internal investigation from within. So they're not necessarily all complaints that came in from outside the agency. We also have in 2020 what we call supervisory inquiries, and these are pretty much complaints that regard the quality of service delivery for the most part. Could be minor policy violations. Complaints, they can vary in degree. They can have to do with an officer or an employee's demeanor, tardiness maybe. Could have to do with their customer service or maybe just a nature of a department practice. In 2020, we had 21 inquiries. Out of those 21 inquiries, 12 of them ended up with unacceptable performance. So there was 11 employees out of the 12 unacceptable performance inquiries that received the unacceptable performance in their file. Now, when we're looking at this slide, this is the slide of all the allegations that came in that were looked into that have to do with internal investigations and supervisory inquiries. There were a total of 41 allegations that were looked into in 2020. Sometimes during an internal or an inquiry, there's more than one allegation on a particular employee that has to be looked into. That's why there's 41 total. And you can see that there was 21 that were no misconduct or acceptable performance, and 20 that had a finding of misconduct or unacceptable performance. This slide shows our collisions for 2020. A collision in our department goes to what's called a collision review whenever a police department employee, while operating a city vehicle or even using their own personal vehicle, but while functioning within the scope of their department responsibilities, and then if they're involved in a collision. And so in 2020, we had 18 collisions and 10 of them were preventable. And so as you can see, I think we've done a pretty good job at declining our collisions since 2017. So when we're specifically looking at corrective action just for collisions, we had the 10 that were preventable. 8 of those resulted in coaching and counseling to the employee, and 2 of them resulted in a written reprimand. There were no suspensions or dismissals for collisions in 2020. And then on this slide, this is the combined discipline outcome for the internal investigations and the inquiries combined. So in 2020, 12 of the misconduct, unacceptable performances resulted in coaching and counseling. We had 5 reprimands, and out of 1 of the internal investigations resulted in a suspension. We did not have any demotions or any dismissals in 2020 as a result of any of the investigations. So now when we move into start talking about use of force statistics, this slide here is showing our total force reports. So we had 231 total force reports in 2020. And out of those force reports, there were 7 allegations of excessive force and 2 of them were sustained. I do want to make sure, and I don't have any text to support this, but so I just want to explain that there were 179 use of force incidents, which resulted in the 231 force reports, which means that sometimes there's more than one officer that uses force on an individual, but it's only one incident, but it might be 2 or 3 officers. So there's going to be more force reports than force incidents. So I think it's important to keep that in mind because of those 73,000 contacts that we have throughout the year, with 179 incidents turn into force. That's a percentage with 231 force reports of just 0.31%. I think that that's a good indication based on the amount of contacts that our officers have of how well they're doing out there in their training and really focusing hard on using their de-escalation techniques to not have to use force if they don't want to use force. And I think they do a good job at not using force most of the time. These 2 allegations that were sustained, they both came from within the department. They were not from a complaint from a citizen or from outside the department. This slide here shows all the different force types available to the officers. These are force types that are available to them to select in their force report, and they're also force types that they're trained on to use. So I think one of note here that I'll highlight a little bit is the VNR, which is vascular neck restraint. So as we know, this has kind of been a national topic, certainly in 2020, talking about the vascular neck restraint and chokeholds. And VNR is not a chokehold, it's separate than an actual chokehold. So we had 34 vascular neck restraint force used in 2020, leading up to the month of about June. So in June timeframe, as a command group, we discussed this and we paused the use of VNR and it's only available for the officers to use in a deadly force type situation. So that's why it's at 34. In the past with VNR, we've probably had somewhere around 50 to 65 uses of VNR in the past, but we are not using that right now in our agency. I will say, and I don't show it on this slide, so you can see the takedowns is 110. That's a pretty big increase from last year. And the only thing that I can think of that is maybe with the officers not using VNR for half the year, probably resulted in more takedowns. So when we look at the slide of effective versus not effective, and what I didn't say on the force types, so just to point that out with the numbers, is sometimes in one force incident, an officer may use more than one force type. And you see that in the effectiveness here. What I'll explain is the officer may start out with using verbal, and then the verbal commands do not work. And so they may need to go to a different force type. They may go to a takedown, or they may go to a hair hold. And it's possible that that particular force type might not be effective to get the person under control. So then they may need to even move to another force type. And that's what this slide is showing, is sometimes the force that the officer uses does not work, and the person continues to resist. And so they move to a different force type in order to try and get that person under control. This slide shows force used resulting in injury. So out of the 231 force reports, there were 88 suspects who were injured. The officers noted that they were either injured or they complained of injury. And there were 35 officers who were injured. So then on the next slide, we'll look at the suspect injury by type. So here on this slide, so what we see is the highest one obviously is cut, bruise, and scrape. And that is most of the injuries that occur when there is an injury. In 2020, we had 0 broken bones. So all of them were all fairly minor injuries. We did have 9 canine applications, and I don't know I couldn't describe the injuries of those 9, but sometimes on a canine application, the injury can be fairly significant, but I'm not sure about those 9. One thing that I will note here is that in 2020, we did have 1 fatal injury due to an officer-involved shooting, which was in December. And that statistic is not represented on this slide. So we're talking about the time of day when most of the force incidents occur. You can see that it's very consistent from year to year. Kind of that 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. time frame is really when most of our use of force occurs. And that has been very consistent, as you can see. Reason for use of force. Now, this chart here shows the reasons that an officer or officers were compelled to begin to use force, and that resulted in the 231 force reports. So as you look at this, you can see that the top 2 are refusing commands and attempting to escape. So that usually are the top 2 that occur. That's what starts the force incident for the officer, and that's what they noted in their report. So on the next slide, what we see is the citizen resistance that the officers noted that was during the force encounter. So after the force began and while the force is going on, this is what the officers noted as the force resistance that they continued to receive during the force. So lots of times they will have multiple resistance noted in their force report. So they may have be given commands to the person, and the person's refusing those commands. Like I said before, the person might then pull away from the officer, who will then use a force type technique to try and get the person under control. Then the person might assault the officer, and those numbers might be reflected here. In 2020, there were 652 documented forms of resistance during the force encounters. So this table here is what the officer was observing or perceiving of the citizen prior to being compelled to use force. And what you can see here from the slide is that what the officers noted is that a person being very agitated, or in the officer's opinion, the person was on alcohol or drugs, are the top two assessments in 2020, and that's pretty consistent throughout the years. These two slides have to do with use of force demographics. So you can see here that, keep in mind here, these numbers are the numbers that are in relation to the just over 73,000 contacts that our officers had in 2020 with only 179 incidents of force. And so this gives us a pretty good indication of the race of the person that force was used on and the gender of the person. And that is the end of my slideshow. If there's any questions.
Council, are there any more questions?
I have a question.
Yep, Yolanda, go for it.
Commander Stalker, on
Yes, ma'am.
the collisions, you said where we have, let me see. You said we've had 10 collisions and we're only 3 months into the year. What kind of, do those people, do we have training for these people that are causing the collisions yearly, or do they receive any extra driving training?
Well, first I'll clarify. So we had 18 collisions in 2020, all of the year of 2020. I think we've only had 1 or 2 collisions so far this year. But yes, when we have collisions, if it's a particular employee that has multiple collisions, then yes, we will have them get with our emergency driving group instructors, and we will make sure that they get to the emergency driving training for this year. Definitely, we do that. Yes.
Okay, and then I have one more if I can. On the time of day where the incidents are really high, is that during the weekends or is that during our days?
Are you on the use of force?
During the week, or are they during the weekend? You said that the times that they're highest is between 1:30 to 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock. Are those the incidents during the weekends for them to be so high, or are they during the week?
I don't have those statistics as far as the actual days, but I do know, I can tell you, I've looked at that before, but I can tell you that it's not necessarily weekends. It would be pretty consistent throughout the whole week.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for Commander Stalker?
Councilmember Stearns has raised his hand.
Councilmember Stearns.
Thank you, Councilmember J-Rush. Thank you, Commander Stalker. I had a few questions. So in the 2019 report that we had, under the allegations, I mean, there were just some different categories, and I don't know if they were included in new categories, because I think there's some more for this year's report. But I was like wondering about, there was like dishonesty and alcohol that I didn't see in this year's report.
Yeah, and the reason for that is we have, I don't know, probably somewhere maybe around 30 or 40 possible allegations that could come in. And if we don't have alcohol showing, then that means that we did not have an investigation that involved alcohol for that year. And so it's somewhat arbitrary. If I'm the one managing the software system, I'll have discussions with other command staff when an allegation comes in on how we're going to title it. And so, yeah, basically it would have to do with that we just didn't have an allegation for this year under that category.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. And then you mentioned the VNR pause, and I'm just wondering, is Is that reflected anywhere in the manual, or is it, is that going to become a policy, or what's sort of the actual process for, its implementation or disimplementation?
Yes, it was sent out as a directive by the chief. And so that puts it automatically in policy for the officers. And so, yes, it is considered in policy.
Okay, so that's something you could send us a copy of that, or?
Yes, sir, I could.
Oh, okay, great. And then the last question was, would it be possible on I think it was the last slide. Now I have to find, oh yeah. Right, yeah, it was last slide, where you have use of force demographics. And would it be possible to break those two down, race and gender, into or put them into like a pie chart so we can see the percentages?
Yeah, that's something I can work on. These were new charts for me, and we talked about this. And you're right. And that is something that I have thought about quite a bit, actually, as far as percentages. I wasn't really sure how to do it, though, because, whether or not you look at percentages, because I don't have any percentages of the 73,000 contacts, right? And so that's something I'll have to look into on how I would break that down by percentage, and would it be to the population? Would it be to the amount of contacts? Would it be the amount of uses of force, or going based on the percentages of race and gender on the census? And so that's something that I definitely would like to look at and try and see what the best way would be to try and calculate that.
Okay.
So I'll definitely work on that for the next report.
All right, yeah, I was just thinking of just adding up like all the gray ones and then doing that, percentage.
Commander
right.
Stocker, I think what Councilmember Stearns might be asking about is your slide on race use of force and gender use of force. Councilmember Stearns, were you asking if that could be further broken down?
Yes, yeah. So like the gender would just be like a pie. And so, most of it would be gray, and
so of the,
right.
let's
Most
say
of it would be.
I got you.
Right.
Yeah, of the 82 white uses of force, how many of those were male versus how many of those were female? Likewise for Hispanic, Native American, and the other categories of race.
Okay. Yep. Nope. I completely overcomplicated that.
Yeah, I was just thinking for gender, so 174 plus 36 is some unknown number to me, but 36 is a percentage of that, so it would be that sort of smaller piece of the pie. And
okay.
Anyway, I'm terrible at math, and I'm even apparently worse at describing stuff. So, but thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions from the council?
Raise your hand.
Councilmember Malenga.
Yes, thank you. My questions were very similar to what Councilmember Stearns was asking on that last slide, the use of force demographics. I was wondering if we could break the data up based on the census population, like you were saying. So if I'm making up numbers, this is not correct. I'm just making up for example purposes. Let's say the percentage of Auburn had 5% Black, let's pretend. Of that, how many of that was their use of force? So looking at it based on whatever we find from the census, seeing what those percentages are like that. Is that possible?
I believe it is, yes. And I will say I do a report for that for our traffic tickets and things like that. And this was the first time I brought this data out for this report. And so I just didn't get a chance to really get into the percentages. And so, yes, I'm going to work on that for sure.
Thank you.
Councilmember Brown's raised his hand.
Councilmember Brown.
Thank you, Councilmember Jayraj. Actually, Councilmember Malenga asked the exact question I wanted to ask. So thank you very much, Councilmember Malenga.
Any other questions from the council? If not, Commander Stalker, thank you very much for that in-depth presentation. Thank you for all the hard work.
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor, it's up to you now.
Thank you, Councilmember J. Raj. All right, we're coming to the end of our agenda, Council. So any other discussion items this evening? Okay, new business. I believe, Councilmember Brown, you had an item on your new business this evening?
Yeah, thank you very much, Deputy Mayor.
Okay, and Councilmember Brown, before you proceed, I just want to tell Council that following Councilmember Brown's presentation on this, we will not be taking any comments or discussion. We want to make sure we don't have any potential issues related to the Open Meeting Publics Act violations. So we will not be taking council comments or discussion. However, I will be asking for a consensus. So a simple head nod, yes or no, or a thumbs up or thumbs down. That would help me in determining whether or not we have a consensus. Yes. So Councilmember Brown, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor DeCoursey.
Yeah, one moment, Councilmember Brown. I just wanted to clarify one thing. It's not a violation of the OPMA, it's a violation of the council rules if we take a vote during this meeting.
You're absolutely correct, Sean. I misspoke on that. And as you just mentioned it, I caught myself without stating that. So yes, we do not want to violate our council rules of procedure. So thank you for correcting me.
I forgot what I was going to talk about. No, I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor DeCoursey. And what I'm going to talk about tonight was a subject that was brought to me by Auburn resident, a couple of them actually, pertaining to an ordinance that was passed both in Burien and in Seattle, and I think a few other locations, and it pertains to hazardous pay. We're all very fortunate that retail grocery workers stayed on the job and made available the food that we all need to buy when we go to the grocery store. And in Seattle, there's an ordinance that provides for $4 an hour hazard pay. In Burien, $5 per hour hazard pay. I was hoping that we could look at the potential of passing a similar ordinance here in Auburn to both help what are normally low-wage workers dealing with a very difficult health issue that they have to deal with every day, and was hoping our city would take a look at that and our council.
Okay, council, based upon Councilmember Brown's presentation, would you like to see this go forward, and either a yes or no thumbs up?
Very much.
Okay.
Am I allowed to ask a question, or I can't ask a question?
I would prefer not to, Councilmember Malinga, because this now we do have a consensus. So this will be coming forward as a staff presentation and a resolution, more likely from our city
Deputy Mayor,
attorney.
we are allowed to have questions. We're just not allowed to take a vote or to get into a discussion, but she can ask a clarifying question before she gives her.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, City Clerk. And I apologize, Councilmember Malinga. Go ahead.
No, I think when you just said that, you just answered my question, because that's what I was asking was next steps would be the staff would bring more information and then we talk more. That's all.
Yes. Right. Okay. So, Mayor, I guess we would have our city attorney draft a resolution or an ordinance based upon this and then go forward from there.
So yes, that can be done. And I believe Councilmember Brown had provided language on a similar ordinance from a neighboring city. And it was provided to you. I believe Antoinette sent it to all council members last week. I believe maybe Tuesday or Wednesday of last week. So yes, it can come back to a study session because I believe it is an ordinance. If you are going to make a law in the city of Auburn, you would need to bring it to a study session first, unless you chose to suspend your own rules.
Right. Thank you very much. So then, yes, council, we will look forward to this at a coming study session and presentation by council, and then from there moving on to a council meeting for a vote. And sorry for any confusion this evening, council. I got a little bit off track on that, but I appreciate your patience with me, and we will move forward. And thank you, Councilmember Brown, for your presentation. And with that, this is the end of our meeting. And just a note for everybody out there who's listening or watching, please get your vaccines. A number of your council members have received vaccines. I get my second dose on March 20th. It's a painless process, and Councilmember Baggett's had two. Councilmember the Trout Manuel's had two. I know Councilmember J. Rogers had his, and at least one. And Councilmember Stearns has had both of his. And as we move forward with this, that is hopefully one of the things that we're doing as a society that will get us back to normal instead of what we're calling this new normal. So take advantage of it when it comes your turn, and please stay safe out there, as we've always said. And thank you for your participation tonight, everybody. And with that,